The most dangerous thing about a surveillance network is not the information it collects. It is the weapon that information eventually becomes. At 1:44 a.m., a United States Army logistics convoy was 18 kilometers southeast of the Conoco gas facility in the Deir ez-Zor region of eastern Syria, moving on a route that had been assessed as clear in the most recent ground intelligence update 6 hours earlier. The convoy was 12 vehicles, 4 MRA P-class armored vehicles, 6 logistics trucks carrying fuel and ammunition, and 2 recovery vehicles at the rear. It was escorted by 2 armed military vehicles at the point and 1 at the tail, and it was in radio communication with the Combined Joint Operations Center at Erbil, and with the MQ-9 Reaper that had been assigned surveillance overwatch of its route since the convoy departed its origin point at 11:30 p.m. The MQ-9's ground control station operator had been watching the convoy's progress through the Reaper's sensor picture for the past 2 hours and 14 minutes. At 1:44 a.m., a notification appeared in the sensor picture that the operator had been briefed to watch for and had not seen in 61 consecutive overwatch missions, a signal anomaly in the radio frequency spectrum above the convoy's current position, not a communications transmission. The anomaly was in the C-band frequency range associated with drone control links, and it was not coming from the convoy itself or from any coalition asset in the area. It was coming from a position approximately 400 meters north of the road, at an elevation consistent with a ground-based emitter rather than an airborne one, a drone control link emitting from a ground position north of the road, in eastern Syria. At 1:44 a.m., the operator transmitted the anomaly to the CJOC at 1:44 a.m. and 31 seconds, characterizing it as a possible unmanned aerial vehicle ground control station on bearing 032 from the convoy's current position. The CJOC acknowledged at 1:44 a.m. and 44 seconds and immediately cross-referenced the transmission against the electronic order of battle picture that the RC-135V rivet joint had been building from a station altitude above the Euphrates Valley for the past 4 hours. The rivet joint's collection system had been cataloging emitters in this sector since 10 p.m. The C-band emission that the MQ-9's sensor had flagged was in the rivet joints picture. It had first appeared at 11:52 p.m., approximately 19 minutes after the convoy departed its origin point. 19 minutes after the convoy departed, a C-band drone control link had activated at a position north of the convoy's planned route. The correlation between the convoy's departure and the link's activation was either coincidental or it was not. The intelligence watch officer at the CJOC who was building the correlation at 1:45 a.m. was a professional who had been trained to distinguish between coincidences that required investigation and correlations that required action, and the distinction between those two categories was not always available in the time the situation provided. At 1:46 a.m., the rivet joint detected a second C-band emission. Different position, southeast of the first, on a bearing that placed it 600 meters south of the convoy's route, approximately 3 kilometers ahead of the convoy's current position on its planned heading. A second drone control station, one north, one south, positioned on opposite sides of the road at a point the convoy would reach in approximately 9 minutes at its current speed. 2 drone control stations flanking the convoy's planned route at its next waypoint. The geometry was specific. The timing was specific. The correlation between the convoy's departure and the first station's activation was 22 minutes. Close enough that the CJOC watch officer was no longer treating it as a coincidence that required investigation. The CJOC directed the convoy to halt immediately and hold its current position at 1:46 a.m. and 22 seconds. The convoy commander acknowledged and the column stopped. The CJOC duty officer transmitted a request for air support to the CAOC at Al Udeid at 1:46 a.m. and 31 seconds. The request characterized the situation: 2 probable Iranian-linked drone control stations flanking the convoy's planned route, assessed as forward elements of a drone ambush network, convoy halted at current position, pending neutralization of the threat. The request asked for SEAD-capable assets capable of employment against ground-based emitters and electronic attack assets capable of suppressing the drone control network's operational frequencies. The CAOC's response at 1:47 a.m. allocated 2 assets that had been on standby at an intermediate staging location in Iraq specifically for this category of tasking, an F-15E Strike Eagle with a full seat and precision strike loadout, and an EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft that had been the night's designated electronic warfare support platform for eastern Syria operations. The 2 aircraft were airborne within 11 minutes and on a direct transit to the Deir ez-Zor sector. While the aircraft were transiting, the rivet joint and the MQ-9 were building the picture that the engagement would require. The rivet joint's collection system was characterizing the 2 C-band emitters in detail: frequency, power level, modulation type, and the specific signal structure of the drone control link's uplink and downlink channels. The characterization was producing a technical profile that matched the Iranian drone control architecture that had been documented in previous collection operations in Iraq and Syria over the preceding 18 months. Specifically, the signal structure matched the control link architecture of the Shahed 136 loitering munition, a one-way attack drone that navigated to a GPS-designated target and detonated a shaped charge warhead on impact, the same platform that had been employed in attacks on commercial shipping and coalition installations on multiple previous occasions. At 1:49 a.m., the rivet joint detected a 3rd emitter. This one was different from the 2 ground control stations. It was airborne, at an altitude of approximately 3,500 feet, bearing 044 from the convoy's position, range approximately 12 kilometers. An airborne contact emitting on the same C-band drone control frequency architecture as the 2 ground stations, but at a power level and emission pattern consistent with an airborne relay or surveillance platform rather than a ground control transmitter. An airborne relay. A drone, or possibly a small aircraft serving as a communications relay between the ground control stations and a command post that was further from the convoy's position than the 400-meter and 600-meter placements of the 2 ground stations. A network with a relay element could be controlled from a position tens of kilometers from the convoy rather than hundreds of meters. A standoff distance that provided significantly more protection for the operators than the ground station placements suggested. The 3-emitter picture was transmitted to the F-15E and EA-18G crews at 1:49 a.m. and 41 seconds, along with the characterization assessment and the engagement priorities that the CJOC had established. The airborne relay was the primary target, because eliminating it would degrade the network's ability to pass updated targeting data regardless of what the ground stations were doing. The 2 ground control stations were secondary and tertiary targets. The F-15E crew received the airborne relay's position and began computing a targeting solution for the contact using their AN/APG-82 AESA radar in air-to-ground mode. The airborne relay was at 3,500 feet. Small radar cross-section, intermittent emission profile as its relay function cycled between transmission and receive modes. Characterizing it precisely enough for a weapon solution required track accumulation. The radar needed multiple contacts against the target before the engagement solution reached sufficient confidence. The EA-18G was doing something different with the same information. The EA-18G's ALQ-99 jamming system had been configured during the transit to the target area with the specific frequency and modulation parameters that the rivet joint had characterized for the drone control network. The jamming configuration was not broadband suppression. It was a targeted, coherent interference package aimed at the specific signal structure of the Iranian control link architecture, designed to inject noise that would degrade the control signal's integrity without completely cutting the link in a way that would cause the drones to revert to their autonomous GPS guidance modes. A drone with a degraded but intact control link was a drone whose operator was trying to manage an increasingly uncertain picture. A drone that had completely lost its link was a drone that would continue on its last programmed heading autonomously until it found its GPS target or ran out of fuel. A more dangerous scenario than a drone under confused operator control. The EA-18G activated its jamming system at 1:53 a.m., when it reached the engagement geometry that the jamming system's effective range required. The rivet joint detected the effect on the drone control network at 1:53 a.m. and 14 seconds. The C-band emissions from both ground control stations shifted frequency within 2 seconds of the jamming activation, an electronic protection response consistent with operators who had detected the interference and were attempting to find a clear channel. The frequency shift was in the direction of the EA-18G's jam band. The operators had shifted toward a frequency that the jamming system's adaptive algorithm was already covering. They had moved into the interference rather than away from it, which was consistent with a system whose frequency agility was limited to a pre-programmed hop sequence rather than an intelligent response to the jamming picture. The network was fighting the jamming. The fight was consuming operator attention and degrading the quality of the control signals reaching the drones. The F-15E crew had the airborne relay's position characterized to engagement confidence at 1:54 a.m. The radar had accumulated sufficient track data from 4 contact events against the relay's emission signature to establish a position fix with an accuracy radius of approximately 200 meters. Within the GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack Munitions accuracy parameters at this range and release geometry. The F-15E flight lead transmitted to the CJOC at 1:54 a.m. and 17 seconds. Relay contact characterized. GBU-38 solution. Request engagement authority. The CJOC authorization came at 1:54 a.m. and 31 seconds. 14 seconds. The GBU-38 released at 1:54 a.m. and 38 seconds. The weapon's GPS guidance system was navigating to the airborne relay's last confirmed position, but the relay was airborne, and an airborne target moving at any speed would not be at its last confirmed position when a GPS-guided weapon arrived. The F-15E crew had addressed this by using the relay's emission pattern to estimate its current position at the time of release and programming the weapon to that estimate rather than to the characterized position from the track average. The estimate's accuracy was a function of the relay's speed and heading stability since last track confirmation. A drone-sized relay platform flying a surveillance orbit over the convoy's area was likely flying a consistent, predictable pattern rather than the random maneuvering that would defeat a position estimate. The GBU-38 impacted at 1:55 a.m. and 12 seconds. The rivet joint's collection picture registered the effect at 1:55 a.m. and 13 seconds. The airborne relay's C-band emission ceased completely. Not a frequency shift. Not a power reduction. Cessation. The relay platform had been incapacitated. The ground control station's emissions changed character at 1:55 a.m. and 22 seconds, 9 seconds after the relay went silent. Both stations shifted from their active control transmission patterns to a lower power emission consistent with a standby or emergency mode. The network had lost its relay capability, and its operators had apparently received no data from the relay channel for 9 seconds. Long enough that whatever protocol governed the system's emergency response had activated. The EA-18G's jamming had been degrading the control signal's quality for 2 minutes and 22 seconds when the relay went down. The combination of degraded signal quality and relay loss produced a network that was, in the rivet joint's assessment, operating in a significantly compromised mode. Operators working without relay support, fighting a jamming system on their control frequencies, attempting to maintain communications with their drone platforms through an increasingly unreliable channel. What the drones were doing during those 2 minutes and 22 seconds was the question that neither the rivet joint's collection picture nor the MQ-9's sensor feed could definitively answer. The MQ-9 had been maintaining its surveillance position above the convoy's halt location and had been scanning the visual and thermal bands for airborne contacts in the corridor between the ground control stations and the convoy. At 1:54 a.m., the sensor operator had detected 3 small thermal contacts at approximately 2,800 feet altitude, bearing 261 from the convoy, range approximately 5 kilometers. Contacts consistent with small fixed-wing or rotary-wing unmanned aerial vehicles in the attack aircraft category, moving toward the convoy's position at approximately 140 knots. 3 drones. Inbound. 5 kilometers and approximately 2 minutes of flight time from the convoy's halt position. The CJOC transmitted the drone detection to the F-15E and EA-18G simultaneously at 1:54 a.m. and 54 seconds, 16 seconds before the GBU-38 impacted the relay. The F-15E crew was already computing the intercept geometry against the 3 airborne contacts as the relay destruction was in progress. The EA-18G was maintaining its jamming suppression of the ground control stations. The F-15E's AN/APG-82 radar resolved the 3 drone contacts at 1:55 a.m. and 9 seconds, 3 seconds before the relay went silent. The contacts were at 4.6 kilometers from the convoy, altitude 2,700 feet, speed 135 knots. Small, low cross-section, flying in a loose echelon formation that was consistent with 3 semi-autonomous platforms that were receiving regular position updates from a control network and were navigating toward a common GPS aim point, the convoy's last known position. After 1:55 a.m. and 22 seconds, when the network entered its emergency mode, the 3 drones would have only their GPS guidance to navigate toward. Their GPS aim point was the convoy's position before it stopped, a position the convoy was no longer at, because the CJOC's halt order had kept it stationary at a point 2.3 kilometers short of the ambush geometry. The GPS aim point was empty desert. The convoy was not there, but 3 drones at 135 knots and 2.4 kilometers were still live threats with explosive payloads, and live threats required engagement regardless of whether their aim point was currently occupied. The F-15E selected its M61A1 rotary cannon at 1:55 a.m. and 30 seconds. Against 3 small, slow targets at close range with an attack geometry that required precision against closely spaced contacts, guns were the appropriate weapon system. Missiles at this engagement range and target size carried unacceptable debris risk relative to the convoy's position. The cannon burst required the F-15E to close to engagement range, which was below the altitude that provided comfortable margin above the drone formation's flight level, and the approach required the crew to manage the geometry of engaging 3 contacts that were not flying in a line, but in a spread that required separate attack runs. The first cannon burst engaged the lead drone at 1:55 a.m. and 44 seconds. Range, 800 meters. The burst struck the drone's airframe across its center section and wing roots. The drone ceased controlled flight immediately, its propulsion and control surfaces destroyed by the impact, the airframe transitioning to ballistic descent toward the desert floor 2,700 feet below. It impacted 900 meters north of the halted convoy. The second drone altered course at 1:55 a.m. and 49 seconds, 5 seconds after the first engagement. Not a tactical defensive maneuver. A course alteration consistent with its GPS guidance system receiving updated waypoint data. The network's emergency mode had apparently included a waypoint update protocol that redirected the drones toward an alternate GPS aim point when the primary aim point became uncertain. The second drone's new heading was northeast, away from the convoy, toward a bearing that the CJOC's tactical picture could not immediately associate with any specific target. The F-15E crew tracked the second drone's course change and recalculated the intercept geometry. A drone that had altered course but was still airborne and carrying an explosive payload was still a threat to something. and the crew's engagement authority covered all three contacts regardless of their current headings. The second cannon burst engaged the second drone at 1:56 a.m. and 4 seconds at a range of 650 meters on its new bearing. Same result: airframe destruction, ballistic descent, impact in open desert. The third drone had not altered course. It was still on its original heading, at 135 knots, now at 1.9 kilometers from the convoy's halt position. Either its GPS guidance had not received the waypoint update that the second drone had received, or its guidance system was operating on a different protocol. Or the update had arrived at the third drone after the second drone's engagement, and the third drone had not yet processed it. The F-15E crew had one cannon burst available at engagement range before the third drone reached the convoy's perimeter. The crew closed to 700 meters and fired at 1:56 a.m. and 19 seconds. The third drone ceased controlled flight at 1:56 a.m. and 20 seconds. It impacted the desert floor 1.1 kilometers from the convoy's halt position, the closest impact of the three, and the one that the convoy commander's personnel, watching from their vehicle positions through night optical equipment, described in their post-incident report as a flash in the dark at a distance that was close enough to produce a clearly audible detonation, and a ground shock that was felt through vehicle frames. All three drones had been incapacitated. None had reached the convoy. The EA-18G maintained its jamming suppression of the two ground control stations for 4 additional minutes, until the rivet joint assessed that both stations had ceased active operations and gone to their lowest power standby emission state, consistent with operators who had concluded the mission had failed and were preparing to displace their equipment. The ground control station north of the road went fully silent at 1:59 a.m. The station south of the road went silent at 2 a.m. The network was inactive. The convoy was intact. The halt position held. The convoy resumed its movement at 2:07 a.m. under the MQ-9's continued overwatch, on a route deviation that bypassed the ambush waypoint geometry that the original route had passed through. The convoy reached its destination at 3:44 a.m. without further incident. The post-engagement assessment at the CJOC identified the critical decision point of the engagement as the MQ-9 sensor operator's C-band anomaly detection at 1:44 a.m. The anomaly had been present for 52 minutes before the sensor operator flagged it. It had been in the rivet joint's collection picture since 11:52 p.m., but the rivet joint's collection tasking had prioritized other emitter categories in the sector until the MQ-9's flag directed the rivet joint's analysis attention to that specific frequency band. 52 minutes during which the drone network had been active and tracking the convoy without an American collection asset, specifically monitoring the control link frequencies it was using. The lesson was specific and operationally significant. The drone network's detection had depended on a MQ-9 sensor operator who had been specifically briefed to monitor C-band anomalies and who had flagged a signal that an automated alert system had not characterized as a threat. Human attention to a briefed threat indicator had detected the network. A system waiting for the drones to appear visually rather than detecting the control network's electronic signature would have detected the threat significantly later, possibly after the drones had closed to distances that made the engagement geometry substantially more difficult. The engagement had also produced an intelligence finding that went immediately to the highest distribution tier, the waypoint update protocol that had redirected the second drone when the network went into emergency mode. A drone network with an in-flight waypoint update capability under emergency conditions was a network that could redirect its weapons in real time based on changes in the target picture, a capability that added a layer of adaptability to the attack architecture that static GPS guidance systems did not have. The second drone's alternate heading, computed backward from its last known position and heading at time of engagement, pointed toward an alternate target that the CJOC's tactical picture identified as the Coalition Logistics Support Point 12 kilometers northeast of the convoy's halt position. The network had not been carrying a single aim point. It had been carrying primary and alternate aim points, and the emergency protocol had shifted the redirectable element of the drone salvo toward the alternate target when the primary became uncertain. 3 drones, 2 aim points, 1 network, and 19 minutes of pre-positioning before the convoy had even left its origin point at 11:30 p.m. At 2:30 a.m., the convoy's route security sweep was complete, and the Rivet Joint had catalogued 4 additional potential ground emitter positions in the eastern Syria corridor that matched the frequency and signal characteristics of the neutralized network's ground control stations. All 4 had been active between 10 p.m. and the network's shutdown at 2 a.m. None of the 4 had been on the convoy's planned route. All 4 were on alternate routes that would have been available to the convoy if its primary route had been blocked or rerouted. Not one network. A distributed network architecture with multiple nodes covering multiple possible routes. The full characterization of that architecture would occupy the intelligence community for the next 72 hours. The convoy was already at its destination. In the eastern Syrian desert at 2:30 a.m., the darkness held nothing visible. The 3 drone impact sites were marked on the tactical picture as small thermal signatures, still radiating the residual heat of their impact detonations against the cold night air. In 6 hours, they would be cooler than the desert floor around them and invisible to any thermal sensor that was not specifically looking for them. The desert absorbs its evidence with thoroughness. The operational picture does not. Every emitter position, every frequency, every timing correlation between the convoy's departure and the network's activation, all of it documented, transmitted, and now part of the threat understanding that would brief the next convoy crew before they departed their origin point. The network had been watching. The sensor operator had been watching the network. In eastern Syria, at 1:44 a.m., the difference between those 2 facts was 12 vehicles and the people inside them. The watch was there first. That is why the convoy was in the morning.